Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a time in every believer's life when the line is drawn in the sand, when faith is not a quiet belief, but a courageous stand. We live in a world that rewards conformity and punishes conviction, where truth is often twisted and integrity is dismissed as outdated. Yet, in such a time as this, we are called not to blend in, but to stand out. The power of conviction is the invisible force that transforms ordinary people into extraordinary instruments of purpose. It is the quiet fire that burns within the soul when everything around seems to collapse, the steady heartbeat of faith that refuses to yield to fear or compromise. Conviction is not mere opinion or preference. It is the unwavering certainty that there are truths worth living for and even dying for. It is the inner voice that whispers, "Do what is right," when every external voice screams, "Do what is easy." Conviction defines the moral spine of a believer. It shapes decisions when others hesitate, and it provides clarity when the world grows clouded with confusion. In the story of Daniel, conviction was not just an idea, it was his way of life. From the moment he was taken from Jerusalem and placed in the courts of Babylon, Daniel faced pressures that could have easily broken a lesser man. He was surrounded by wealth, influence, and the allure of acceptance. Yet Daniel understood that his faith was not something to be negotiated or adjusted according to convenience. His convictions were rooted not in circumstance, but in the unchanging nature of God. He knew that the same God who had been faithful in Jerusalem would remain faithful in Babylon, even when the culture demanded compromise. His conviction was not dependent on the comfort of his surroundings. It was anchored in the consistency of his relationship with the Lord. Conviction begins in the heart long before it is tested in public. Daniel's decision to pray, even when forbidden, did not come from a sudden burst of courage. It was the natural expression of a life disciplined by daily faithfulness. Conviction is like a muscle. It is strengthened by consistent use, by the small decisions we make when no one else is watching. When Daniel was told that prayer to anyone but the king would result in death, he did not have to deliberate. His conviction had already been settled. Long before the decree was signed, Daniel had decided who he was and whom he served. That is the essence of conviction. It is pre-decided obedience. It does not wait for the crisis to choose. It chooses long before the crisis arrives. We live in a world where conviction is often mistaken for intolerance, where standing for truth can be labeled as arrogance or insensitivity. Yet true conviction is never rooted in pride. It is born of humility before God. It is the recognition that truth does not belong to us, it belongs to Him. Conviction is not about proving oneself right, it is about being faithful to what is right. It is not loud or self-promoting, but it is steadfast and immovable. When the world shifts, conviction holds the line. When culture bends, conviction stands tall. When voices mock or threaten, conviction remains calm because it knows that faithfulness is not measured by popularity, but by obedience. The power of conviction becomes most visible in the face of opposition. Daniel did not challenge the law with rebellion or anger. He simply continued doing what he had always done, praying to his God with his window open toward Jerusalem. He did not hide his faith, nor did he flaunt it. He lived it. That is the quiet strength of conviction. It doesn't require a stage or a spotlight. It simply remains consistent, even when consistency costs everything. And it was that very consistency that drew the attention of heaven. Conviction also has a magnetic effect on others. It commands respect even from those who disagree. King Darius, though deceived into signing the decree, recognized Daniel's integrity. There was something about Daniel's faith that even a pagan king could not ignore. Conviction has a way of revealing truth in unexpected places. People may not understand your faith, but they cannot deny the power of a life shaped by it. When conviction governs your choices, your life becomes a testimony louder than any sermon. The power of conviction is also deeply personal. It brings peace in the midst of uncertainty because it frees you from the tyranny of compromise. A person without conviction is easily swayed, living at the mercy of opinions and circumstances. But a person of conviction walks with clarity and courage because their heart has already been anchored in something eternal. Daniel could enter the lion's den without panic because his faith had already made peace with the outcome. He did not know whether God would deliver him, but he knew God was worthy of trust no matter the result. That is the power of conviction. It steadies the heart when outcomes remain unseen. Every generation faces its own lions, and every believer is called to live out conviction in their own Babylon. The challenges may differ, but the principle remains the same. Conviction will always be tested, and only those who have resolved in their hearts beforehand will stand firm when the trial comes. Conviction is not shaped in the roar of the lions, but in the quiet moments of daily faithfulness, prayer, and obedience. It is the hidden strength that sustains the public stand. It is the unseen root that produces visible fruit. Conviction is the power to remain true when truth is costly, to hold fast when others let go, to trust God when the world turns against you. It is not an emotional reaction, but a spiritual resolve. It does not depend on applause, agreement, or outcome. It simply depends on God. And when conviction is anchored in Him, no lion, no decree, and no kingdom can shake it. We live in a world that rewards convenience far more than conviction, a culture that urges us to take the easy road instead of the right one. The values of this generation are often measured by comfort, success, and acceptance rather than integrity, faith, and truth. Everywhere we turn, there is pressure to conform, to blend into the crowd, to soften our beliefs, and to avoid offense, and to adapt our standards to whatever seems popular or practical. The tragedy is that this spirit of compromise is not just found in the world outside. It has crept into the hearts of believers who have forgotten that faith was never meant to be convenient. The story of Daniel reminds us that true faith shines brightest when it refuses to bow to the idols of convenience and conformity. Daniel lived in a culture remarkably similar to ours. Babylon was a kingdom of luxury, intelligence, and power, a society that prided itself on progress and tolerance, yet demanded submission to its values. It was a world of great opportunity, but also of great compromise. Daniel was not living in a godly environment. He was living at the heart of a pagan empire where his faith was neither welcome nor understood. Yet amid that setting, he did not allow the surrounding culture to redefine his convictions. He held fast to his faith in God, even when the pressures to conform were overwhelming. He did not need to shout or protest, he simply lived differently. And that difference was visible because conviction, when genuine, always sets a person apart. The temptation of compromise often begins subtly. It rarely starts with open rebellion against God. It starts with small concessions, tiny adjustments that seem harmless at first. For Daniel, it might have been easier to skip a few prayers, to close the window so no one would see, to reason that God would understand. But Daniel knew that every small act of compromise weakens the strength of faith. The moment we begin to adjust truth to fit our surroundings, we lose the power that truth brings. The strength of Daniel's witness was not in grand gestures, but in quiet consistency. He remained faithful in the little things, and because of that, he stood firm when the greater test came. Our culture celebrates tolerance, but often at the expense of truth. It tells us that right and wrong are subjective, that morality can shift with opinion, and that everyone should define their own version of truth. Yet, when everything is relative, conviction becomes impossible. If truth changes with the wind, no one can stand upon it. Daniel's story calls us back to the unchanging standard of God's word. While the laws of Babylon shifted, God's word remained the same. While kings came and went, Daniel's loyalty to God did not. In a world that constantly changes its moral code, the people of God must be anchored to something eternal. Without that anchor, we are swept away by the tides of public opinion and personal convenience. Compromise is often disguised as wisdom. It whispers, "Be reasonable, don't cause trouble," or "You can still believe in God without being so rigid." Yet faith is not measured by how well we blend in, but by how faithfully we stand out. The cost of compromise may not always be immediate, but it is inevitable. Every time we choose convenience over conviction, our spiritual foundation weakens. The more we bend to please the world, the less we resemble the one who called us out of it. Daniel's courage in Babylon was not about defiance for its own sake, it was about devotion. His loyalty was to God first, and everything else came second. The world today is full of modern Babylons, systems of thought and culture that promise comfort and success if only we will conform. They ask us to pray less, to speak less of our faith, to accept what God rejects, and to call good what He calls evil. They offer applause for silence and ridicule for conviction. But faith that compromises to survive will never have the strength to stand when tested. The lions of Daniel's day may have had teeth and claws, but the lions of our time are more subtle: fear of rejection, loss of reputation, and the desire for approval. Yet the principle remains the same: compromise may save you from the lions, but it will separate you from the favor of God. Daniel's example reminds us that the safest place in the world is not in the king's court, but in the center of God's will. He was thrown into the lion's den not because he did something wrong, but because he refused to do what was wrong. The world may not understand such faith, but heaven honors it. While others bowed to comfort, Daniel stood in conviction. And because of that, God's power was revealed. The miracle of his deliverance was not just about lions' mouths being shut. It was about the unshakable truth that God defends those who refuse to compromise their devotion. In every age, believers must decide whether they will conform to the culture or transform it through faithfulness. The world of compromise is seductive because it offers peace without confrontation and faith without sacrifice, but it cannot offer the peace of a clear conscience or the joy of divine approval. Daniel's life teaches us that integrity is not determined by circumstance, but by character. He stood firm in a foreign land, surrounded by people who did not share his faith, yet his light could not be dimmed. It is not the comfort of the environment that sustains us, it is the courage of conviction within us. When faith refuses to bend, God moves in ways the world cannot understand. The world of compromise may glitter with opportunity, but it is hollow without truth. The call to stand apart, to live by conviction, is not an outdated relic of ancient faith. It is the heartbeat of every true believer. The test of faith is not found in moments of comfort, but in moments of crisis. It is easy to speak of trust when life is calm, but real faith is revealed when the winds rise and the night grows long. The story of Daniel in the 6th chapter of the book that bears his name is not simply a tale of courage. It is the unfolding of faith under fire. It is the moment when what Daniel believed in his heart was tested in the harshest possible way. Faith, when untested, is like a seed that has never touched the soil. It may look full of potential, but only through trial does it grow roots strong enough to endure. Every believer must face that moment when faith ceases to be theory and becomes reality. For Daniel, that moment came when obedience to God meant certain danger, and yet he chose to trust rather than retreat. Faith is not proven in public applause, but in private decisions. Daniel's greatest test did not begin in the lion's den. It began in his room when he heard that the decree had been signed. The law of the land now forbade any prayer to any god except the king. It was not a suggestion. It was a command backed by the penalty of death. Daniel could have rationalized his obedience away. He could have said, "God knows my heart. I'll just pray silently for 30 days. After all, what difference would it make?" But faith cannot live in disguise. True trust in God is not conditional. It does not bow to convenience or fear. So Daniel went home, opened his window toward Jerusalem, and prayed as he had always done. He did not alter his devotion to fit the decree. His test of faith was not about survival. It was about surrender. The test of faith always demands a choice between trusting God's promise and protecting our own security. It asks, do you believe God is still sovereign when obedience costs you everything? Daniel's faith had been prepared for this moment through years of faithfulness in smaller things. He had trusted God when interpreting dreams, when refusing the king's food, and when navigating the treacherous politics of Babylon. Every act of obedience had trained his heart to rely on God more than on position, reputation, or comfort. When faith is built on daily trust, it will not crumble when the crisis comes. Daniel did not suddenly discover courage. He drew from a reservoir of faith that had been growing through every act of quiet obedience. The nature of faith is not to escape trials, but to endure them. When Daniel was arrested and brought before King Darius, there was no evidence of panic or protest. His faith gave him peace in the presence of danger. The king himself was deeply troubled, realizing too late the consequence of his decree. Yet Daniel's calm stood in stark contrast to the anxiety of the ruler. That is the mark of tested faith. It brings serenity where others find only fear. Daniel knew that his future did not rest in the king's hands, but in the hands of God. Faith does not always know the outcome, but it always knows the character of the one who holds the outcome. The lion's den was not Daniel's defeat. It was his proving ground. It was there that the invisible strength of faith became visible to an unbelieving world. The moment the stone was rolled across the entrance, faith had to face its greatest test, trusting without sight, believing without evidence. That night must have been long and filled with uncertainty, but faith is not built on what can be seen. It rests on what has been promised. The God who had been faithful in Daniel's youth would not abandon him in his trial. Faith clings to that assurance even when every earthly reason to hope is gone. The miracle that followed was not just the closing of the lions' mouths, it was the triumph of faith over fear. When morning came and the king found Daniel untouched, it was not simply a victory for one man, it was a revelation to an entire empire. Through Daniel's test, God displayed his power in a way no law or argument could have accomplished. The king proclaimed the greatness of Daniel's God to all the land. What began as a test of faith ended as a testimony of divine faithfulness. That is how God works. He allows the trial to reveal his power, the darkness to reveal his light, and the test to reveal his truth. Every believer will face their own lion's den. It may not be filled with beasts, but it will hold fear, uncertainty, loss, and doubt. It may be a diagnosis, a betrayal, or a moment when obedience to God costs something precious. The question will always be the same: will you trust him even here? The test of faith is not about whether we can avoid the den, but whether we can rest in the den knowing that God is still in control. Daniel did not know if God would deliver him, but he knew that God was able to deliver him, and that confidence was enough. Faith that has never been tested cannot be trusted. It is through testing that faith is purified, strengthened, and made unshakable. Daniel's story reminds us that God does not always keep us from the trial, but he always keeps us through it. The same faith that sustained Daniel in Babylon can sustain us in our modern trials. When we are surrounded by the lions of fear, opposition, or uncertainty, we can remember that the God who was faithful then is faithful now. The test of faith is not about proving our strength to God. It is about discovering his strength within us when everything else falls away. Standing firm in the lion's den of life is not about facing literal beasts, but about confronting the trials, fears, and oppositions that threaten to shake our faith. Every believer, in one way or another, finds themselves surrounded by lions, forces that roar against conviction, whisper doubt, and seek to devour courage. For Daniel, the lions were real and deadly. For us, they take different forms. They may come as the fear of rejection, the weight of uncertainty, the pressure to conform, or the loneliness that follows obedience. The essence of the story in Daniel 6 is not just survival, it is steadfastness. It is the unwavering resolve to remain faithful even when the world watches and waits for your failure. Daniel's stand was not impulsive, it was the result of a lifetime of discipline. He did not face the lions because of rebellion, but because of righteousness. His faithfulness made him a target, and yet he never allowed fear to dictate his choices. When he prayed with his window open, he was declaring silently, "My trust is in God, not in circumstance." Standing firm in the lion's den begins long before the den itself. It begins in the heart of a person who has already decided that obedience is not optional. Daniel's courage was not born in the moment of crisis. It was the overflow of consistent communion with God. In the lion's den, Daniel did not argue, negotiate, or panic. He rested in the faithfulness of God. That image of a man surrounded by predators yet unshaken captures what spiritual endurance truly looks like. Life's lions may roar loudly, but they cannot harm what God has chosen to protect. Fear may circle around you, but peace stands guard when faith takes root. The presence of the lions did not mean the absence of God. On the contrary, it was in that den that the presence of God became most real. The angel that shut the lions' mouths is the same power that strengthens believers today when they stand in the face of adversity. Standing firm in the lion's den of life means choosing faith when fear makes more sense. It means praying when silence feels safer, obeying when compromise would be easier, and trusting when logic demands doubt. Every trial is an invitation to demonstrate who your trust truly belongs to. Daniel could have tried to defend himself, but he understood that his defense came from above. Faith does not always deliver us from the den, but it always sustains us within it. The lion's den is not the end of faith. It is the proving ground of faith. The beauty of Daniel's story is that his steadfastness did not just protect him, it transformed others. When the king saw that Daniel's God had delivered him, his heart was changed. One man's courage turned an entire kingdom's attention toward heaven. That is what happens when believers stand firm amid life's lions. The world takes notice. They see peace where panic should be, strength where fear should reign, and hope where despair should live. In those moments, faith becomes contagious. Standing firm in the lion's den of life is not merely about endurance. It is about revelation. It is through the den that the power, protection, and presence of God are made undeniable to all who watch. A call to courage today is not simply an invitation to admire Daniel's faith, but a challenge to live it out in our own generation. The world does not need more comfortable believers. It needs courageous ones, men and women who will stand firm in truth even when the cost is high. Every era demands its Daniels, those who will not be swayed by the roar of the crowd or the fear of consequence. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward in spite of it. It is the steady belief that God's will is greater than man's threat, that obedience is more valuable than approval, and that faithfulness matters more than safety. We live in a time where the pressure to compromise is relentless. Truth is questioned, conviction is mocked, and faith is often pushed to the margins. Yet this is precisely the kind of environment in which courage is most needed. It is easy to have faith when faith is fashionable, but real courage is revealed when standing for God brings ridicule or rejection. The call to courage today is not to loud defiance, but to quiet determination, to live faithfully, speak truthfully, and love boldly in a world that has forgotten what those words mean. Courage today may not place us in a literal lion's den, but it will place us in difficult conversations, unpopular positions, and uncomfortable choices. It might cost us relationships, opportunities, or reputation. But like Daniel, we must remember that standing for God always leads to His favor, even if it first leads through fire or trial. The courage God calls us to is not reckless, it is rooted in trust. It believes that God honors those who honor Him, and that His presence is enough even when the outcome is uncertain. Every believer has a moment of decision, a moment when they must choose between silence and stand, between comfort and conviction. The courage to stand today begins not with grand gestures, but with daily faithfulness, choosing integrity at work, prayer over worry, truth over deceit, forgiveness over resentment. These small acts of courage build the strength to face the greater trials ahead. God does not ask us to be fearless, He asks us to be faithful. And when we take our stand in faith, He stands with us. The call to courage today is not just about enduring the times, it is about transforming them through lives that refuse to bend to fear and instead rise in unwavering trust in the God who still shuts the mouths of lions.